Today on Rescue USA.
The flash flood's right there!
Flash floods send mud, boulders, and debris slamming into a California community, destroying everything in its path.
A wave of mud just came roaring through the front of the house.
And with survivors buried in the wreckage, will rescuers get to them in time? Plus, record rainfall leaves one Oregon man trapped in a raging ravine.
Water's coming in through the passenger side window. Suddenly I'm in water up to here.
It's times like these when we need a hero to help save the day.
Living through one natural disaster is difficult, but two within a matter of weeks? Surreal. At the end of 2017, the people of Montecito, California were tortured by a devastating wildfire. And then, just weeks later, they were pummeled by a mudslide. Luckily, first responders were right there to save the day.
Montecito is a gorgeous suburb of Santa Barbara, California.
A lot of people come here because of the beauty and the wonderful surroundings that we have here.
It's small enough that when you go to the grocery store, you see people that are familiar, and it's just a beautiful community.
It offers stunning beaches and majestic mountain ranges. But in 2017, this picturesque area was devastated by a wildfire.
Around December 4th, the Thomas Fire started and it grew rapidly. The fire intensity removed nearly all the vegetation above the hill slopes of Montecito.
The scorched earth left in the wake of the Thomas Fire would have disastrous consequences.
The vegetation is this protective blanket that protects the soil from erosion. When that's removed by the fire, the soil is very vulnerable to rainstorms afterwards. So when it rains, water beads up on the hill slopes, and as it runs off, it begins to pick up the soil. It begins to collect more and more. It gets bigger and bigger.
In the weeks following the fire, Nelson Trickler of Santa Barbara Search and Rescue was keeping a close eye on the weather and that barren mountainside.
We knew based on prior experiences of fires that the chance of having some type of flood event was very, very high.
We had people in Montecito that had been evacuated for the Thomas Fire multiple times. And now we were asking them to evacuate again for this storm event with no threat of fire.
But unfortunately, so many people were fatigued from many fire evacuations, so they ignored the voluntary evacuation.
It's important to take any evacuation warning seriously. These first responders are trained to spot potential dangers. And just because it isn't mandatory doesn't mean it isn't extremely important.
In the early morning hours of January 9th, the storm hit, and it hit hard.
The National Weather Service is closely watching their weather radar, and they see this band of intense precip, and it's making a bullseye for Montecito.
Another firefighter and I heard this sound from the west side. It sounds like 1,000 freight trains. He was like, I think that's a mudslide.
Ventura 29201, there is a very active mudslide coming down Olive Mill towards the 101 right now.
But this was much worse than any mudslide. This was called a debris flow. It's a powerful mixture of water, mud, boulders, and even trees. It was moving extremely fast, picking up cars, demolishing homes, and destroying entire neighborhoods.
Turn around! The flash flood's right there! The flash flood's right there! Get out of here! Go!
Mike, get in the car! Mike, get in the car! Get in the car, Mike! Get in the car!
Debris flow flows super fast, faster than you can run, and it can be super deep. In the case of Montecito, over 20 feet deep.
Kim Canton lives in Montecito and was desperately trying to get her family out when disaster struck.
A wave of mud just came roaring through the front of the house. I all of a sudden went under the mudslide, which was really like roaring rapids. It was really powerful. You couldn't stand up, and I thought I was gonna die.
Kim's daughter, Lauren, was in a different part of the house when she was overtaken by that violent force of nature.
A wave of water started rushing in, and I was spun around and thrown everywhere. Eventually, everything just stopped moving, and I was stuck. I couldn't move at all.
In the pre-dawn hours of January 9th, 2018, a deadly mixture of mud and wreckage smashed into the community of Montecito, California. With thousands of people trapped in that sludge, first responders were about to be tested.
The captain said, hey, we can't get the engine out of the station. San Ysidro is completely flooded and it's impassable.
With entire neighborhoods washed away, firefighter and paramedic Andy Rupp knew what he had to do, and he immediately started searching for survivors.
It was a really unique situation for us as firefighters because oftentimes we're directed where to go by people calling for help. And this was more of a time when we realized we needed to go try and figure out if in fact there were people that needed rescuing.
All the street signs, all the mailboxes were all gone. So we had no references for the addresses. But I think that's one of the times that really hit me, the scope and the magnitude and the destruction was realizing that we're at the right place. There's just no houses there to find.
These first responders often experience the same amount of tragedy and loss as the rest of the community. But unlike other people, they have to persevere to make sure they get their job done.
In looking around the area, there really wasn't any physical features there. The terrain was pretty much just mud. You could see the height of the flow was 15, 20 feet high by the mud that was on the trees.
When Kim Canton woke up, she was severely injured and trapped in a pile of wreckage, unaware that she'd been swept over the length of 2 football fields from her home.
I could hear roaring river on one side, exploding electrical wires on another side, so I knew it was probably better for me just to lay there, because if my leg got released and I moved, I could end up in the roaring rapids or get electrocuted. I yelled, help, help, help. I heard someone saying, we're coming to get you.
She had her legs wrapped in wire and had some injuries, and they needed some help getting her off of that pile.
And he said, where was the house? And that was a really somber moment when he put it in the past tense.
Andy and his team were able to miraculously pull Kim from the debris to safety, but her daughter Lauren was still missing. They asked her where her house might be.
And so I pointed my hand over my head, just kind of thinking I might have been in my backyard somewhere. So I was kind of thinking the house is back there.
And as she pointed in that direction, there was a huge debris pile that had multiple cars up on top of it. And so it seemed like a likely possibility that there might be someone in the cars or kind of hanging onto that debris pile.
What they didn't know was that she was buried under a mountain of wreckage.
I heard talking, and that's when I realized that I had to get someone to find me. So I started screaming just as loud as I could.
We made access to the debris pile. Captain Hauser stayed on the ground. There were power lines draped onto part of the pile, so we had to be very cautious of where we were walking on that. There was also a natural gas main that was blowing off, so it sounded like a jet engine there. So Ben and I were talking, really screaming at each other from a couple feet away. I climbed up onto the pile. He stopped me, he said, "Did you hear that?" He said, "Someone's calling for help." And sure enough, once I got my head down closer to that pile, I could hear Lauren Canton calling out for help.
But this rescue was not going to be easy. One false step and the pile could collapse on Lauren.
We were able to move things like a refrigerator, a transistor from a telephone pole, the big toolbox that goes in the back of a pickup truck, and then started again working on some of the wood and debris that was in there.
And then once I was out, I stood up and kind of just looked around at everything for a sec. I just remember thinking, wow, because once I looked out, there was one house standing where our whole neighborhood used to be, and all the trees were down. Everything was just an open space.
How are you feeling? Are you okay?
Oh, perfect.
What's up, Ms. Mark? Okay.
Lauren was transported to a hospital, but her mother, Kim, had been admitted to a different facility, so she had no idea that her daughter had been saved.
I was in the emergency room. I remember a door opened and they said, "Do you have a daughter named Lauren?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "They just rescued her."
Days later, Kim and Lauren were finally reunited.
It was very emotional. She was very bruised and purple and, hooked up to a lot of things. She couldn't really move.
Kim and Lauren experienced unimaginable loss that day. But in the months after, they also found strength from the support of the Montecito community.
It's one day at a time. It was the night the unimaginable happened. You try to take joy in the human kindness that you've seen from so many people in the community.
They've even forged a special bond with Andy and the other first responders who saved their lives that day.
I'm so indebted to them. And then they've since been very supportive, where my daughter likes to sing and they come to her performances.
I've stayed in contact with Kim and Lauren. I'm just happy to stay in touch with them and hope that it continues for a long time.
Through the whole awful tragedy, thankfully, healing has begun. And although it's going to take a lot of time, the people of Montecito have really come together to support one another.
One of the things that I have learned from this is that the generosity and the goodwill of people and neighbors who don't know each other come together. And we saw that several times during that day of people just stepping up to help out where they could.
Junction City, Oregon gets about 150 days of rain and snow each year, so people there are pretty used to dealing with wet weather. But when a storm moved in April 2019, one man underestimated the power of nature and was left trapped in a flooded ravine. Luckily, first responders came up with a clever but untested rescue plan.
Junction City is a quiet little farming community about 15 miles outside of Eugene. With a population of just over 5,000, it's your typical rural American city.
Small, quiet town. It's kind of always been that way. It's definitely growing as the years go, though.
It's the kind of place that people go to escape the pressure of big city life, which is what Philip Schultz did nearly 40 years ago.
I wanted to get out of Los Angeles, and I wanted to get a graduate degree and finish my degree, and taught here 31 years.
It's said that there's not much to do in a small town, but talk about the weather. But in Junction City, weather is an important topic, and it's constantly changing.
The weather's very moody in Junction. I mean, we don't get very much snow, but we got 14 inches this year, which is not normal for us.
And in April of 2019, a major storm had everyone talking. Suddenly, the town was facing widespread flooding.
We had 8 inches of rain, which caused the reservoirs to flood.
In order to relieve pressure of the overflowing reservoirs, dams were open to release excess water.
They had to let water out of Fern Ridge Reservoir, which flooded the Long Tom River, which is to the west of us. And then they also let water out of Cottage Grove Lake, which flooded the Willamette River, which is where most of our water that caused the problems was coming from.
But this caused additional flooding in ravines and roads. So first responders knew that they'd have to be prepared to pull people out of that raging floodwater.
We usually don't have water rescues except for during the summertime. But when we see the flooding, we know that it's going to be not just the river, it's going to be actually out in the farmlands as well, and possibly in town. This is something we don't do that often. We might do a water rescue once a week during the summertime, and we had already done about 5 in the 24-hour period.
After 2 days of battling the floods, the storm was starting to let up, but Junction City was not out of danger yet. And that's when Philip Schultz made a decision that could have cost him everything.
If you live in this area, you're going to have to deal with Mother Nature, and that's how I got into my predicament. I was going to challenge Mother Nature.
Tired of being trapped indoors, Philip decided to drive to a local restaurant to pick up some takeout. As he pulled out of his driveway, even he knew that this probably wasn't the best idea.
And I said, if you were smart, you'd just go back to the house. But I didn't. I turned to the right, and knowing that I have 4-wheel drive, I headed down the road. The problem was, You couldn't see where the edges of the road were. The water was just pouring over, and all of a sudden, boom.
In any kind of high-risk situation, it's extremely important to take extra precautions. We all know the saying, better safe than sorry. Well, in this case, Philip would end up being very sorry.
Philip thought he could safely navigate the dangerous conditions, but what he didn't realize was that the floodwater had made it impossible to see the edge of the road, and that there was a deep ravine running alongside of it. When he hit a jog in the road, his truck flipped and ended up in that ravine.
Water's coming in through the passenger side window. Suddenly I'm in water up to here, and it's tipped like this.
In April of 2019, one of the worst floods in 20 years hit Junction City, Oregon. When floodgates were opened to relieve the straining dams, roads and highways became impassable. So when Philip Schultz took his chances on the road, he took his life into his own hands.
The problem was you couldn't see where the edges of the road were. The water was just pouring over, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm down in the water and tipped.
With a river raging around him and his truck filling with water, Philip needed to get out fast.
Water was coming up from underneath, and I was tipped, so the passenger side water was now up at the dash level, and I'm sitting in water up to here.
Luckily, a neighbor spotted him and called 911.
We had just finished a rescue in Monroe when there was another call come across the radio, and it was a water rescue call on Norton Road that we were able to drive to.
Once Fire Chief Griffith and Captain Slocum arrived, they immediately assessed the situation.
The water is really the most dangerous thing we deal with. It's a force of its own, and we have no way to control it.
It could have pushed the truck easily into a different position to where it would have been harder to get him. The worst thing that could have happened would have been the water pushing the truck over and putting it upside down with him trapped inside of it.
Griffith and Slocum quickly realized that they had few options to get to Philip. So they came up with an unusual rescue plan.
Our strategy for removing the victim from his truck was to take a ladder, bridge the gap between the two vehicles, and lock it in place.
Once the ladder was put in place, Captain Slocum would scale across it to get to Philip. But this was a risky maneuver.
Our ladder stretched so thin on such a distance, I was just a little concerned about the ladder failing at the weight.
In an emergency situation, first responders have to think on their feet and do whatever they can to make the rescue. Often, this puts their own lives at risk.
But they had no time to waste. So Captain Slocum tied a rope around himself and made his way across that unstable makeshift bridge to Philip's truck.
I'm trying to stay on the truck and have some sort of a stability while I help him across the rungs of the ladder to the other guys so they could get a hold of him before anything else happened.
Thankfully, Philip made it to safety, thanks to a team of trained professionals and an unconventional rescue plan.
That is the essence of rescue. This would be a good teaching tool.
I am always proud of our team. We win together, we fail together. Fortunately, we win more than we fail.
Philip is forever indebted to the men who saved his life that day. And coming out to the spot where the accident happened, he knows how lucky he is to have survived.
I'm grateful that I'm still here with my family and friends and so forth. But the point is that when we all leave houses, be grateful because you don't know if you're going to make it back.
Captain Slocum has some words of advice for anyone wanting to tempt the hands of fate.
When you can't see the lines, it's a bad idea to drive through the water. You don't know if the road's washing out. You don't know what's going on under there.
Always remember, staying safe begins with personal responsibility. You have to check that forecast and be prepared and mindful of potential dangers and disasters. If a warning's issued, take action. You won't regret it. I'm Ginger Z. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.